Hello and welcome to this episode of China Edge live show. Edge is a comprehensive database of Chinese companies for investors and due diligence researchers. I'm your host, Lizzie, an MIT-trained economist turned journalist here at Wall Street TV who covers China and its relation to the world. Joining me today is Mr. Bill Klein, currently a consulting partner with FGS Global. Prior to that, Mr. Klein dedicated a majority of his diplomatic career to leadership roles at the heart of the U.S.-China relationship. Mr. Klein served as acting deputy chief of mission, chargé d'affaires ad interim, and minister counselor for political affairs at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing from 2016 to 2021. Mr. Klein will help us understand the current state of bilateral relationship, as well as the geopolitical risks associated with the Chinese equity market. Thank you so much, Mr. Klein, for being here with me.
You're welcome, Lizzie. It's my honor.
So, Mr. Klein, we know days after China held a series of unprecedented military drills surrounding Taiwan, China actually published its first white paper on Taiwan since Xi Jinping came to power. As you know, the document has no mention of Beijing's prior promise of sending no troops or administrators to Taiwan after reunification. Does that signal a change in the one country, two system model? More generally, how has Speaker Pelosi's visit changed Beijing's Taiwan calculus?
Yeah, Lizzie, I think that those changes that you mentioned will certainly continue to generate a lot of discussion, not only outside of China, but also among Chinese commentators in the coming days and weeks. I think this is a very important document. It is indeed the first since Xi Jinping came to power, following two white papers that China published with respect to Taiwan in 1993 and in the year 2000, I believe. One can ask themselves, why is this paper being published now? I think that if you look at the paper, it's obvious that it required a lot of preparation. So it was certainly not something that was published hastily after the Pelosi visit. I suspect that this paper was prepared for the upcoming party Congress of the Communist Party, that its goal is to embed the Communist Party's Taiwan policy under the leadership of Xi Jinping in a very explicit manner, and that its publication date was moved forward in response to the Pelosi visit. Indeed, commentators are already poring over this document and comparing it with statements or with the two earlier documents, as well as with other key statements that Chinese leaders have said with respect to Taiwan in the past few years. Having said that, I think that this paper also demonstrates a lot of consistency, and most importantly, remains very, very consistent about what China's ultimate objectives are with respect to Taiwan. China intends to obtain de facto and de jure sovereignty over Taiwan, and this document makes it very, very clear that, as in the past, there is no change to these aspirations, and that if anything, China is doubling and tripling down in its goals. With respect to the one country, two systems question, I think it's important to point out that one country, two systems never enjoyed a lot of popular support in Taiwan. Across the political spectrum, all of the democratic parties in Taiwan have rejected the concept of one country, two systems. Even former KMT President Ma Ying-jeou, who is credited with having a policy aimed at bringing Taiwan closer to China, was also very, very explicit over the years in his rejection for this concept. I think that as China has formulated this concept, in particular, given all of the events in Hong Kong over the past several years, that this has further, devalued this concept in the eyes of people in Taiwan, and so that China has a very, very big challenge if indeed its goal remains to win over the hearts and minds of the people on Taiwan for peaceful unification. I think as a whole, this paper will not help China's case in Taiwan. With respect to Nancy Pelosi's visit and what its meaning actually is for the bilateral relationship, there's this old adage that there's never a good time for things like this in U.S.-China relations, but also sometimes are worse than others. And I think from a Chinese perspective, this was seen as the timing of this visit was seen, Lizzie, as particularly provocative, given the party Congress coming up. I also think that it is important to see this visit in the context of the U.S.-China relationship. As relations have worsened, as China has ascribed the intentions to the United States of trying to contain China, or try to thwart China's modernization aspirations. They view this visit in that context, and they see this visit as a further attempt to eternalize the separation between Taiwan and China, and to make even more difficult China's ultimate aspirations for Taiwan. I do not believe that this was the intention of the visit, but this is, I think, how China perceives it. Is this changing China's calculus? I do think that the visit created a new status quo. I think that some of the military activity that we have been seeing around Taiwan will probably be normalized and become more frequent moving forward. Just exactly what that looks like, I think it's too early to tell. Only time will tell there.
Right. And speaking of Taiwan's position in the global supply chain, TSMC chair Mark Liu recently told CNN in an interview that the company's advanced chip factory would become inoperable in the event of a PRC invasion. Has the world become too reliant on TSMC and creates more vulnerability from that?
I think, Lizzie, that COVID demonstrated the brittleness of many of the supply chains that we have taken for granted over the years. And we're already seeing that companies around the world are taking a very, very good hard look at their supply chains, at the reliability and dependability of their supply chains. We are also seeing that partially in response to COVID, but also certainly in response to growing competition between the United States and China. And here, from a European perspective, against the backdrop of increasing European concerns about China's intentions, that governments are also taking a very, very hard look at supply chains from a perspective of economic and national security, and that we are already seeing a wide range of measures being taken to address the issue of supply chain dependability. Obviously, this is not restricted only to issues such as pharmaceutical inputs, personal protective gear, electric battery components, etc., but also, and very, very importantly, semiconductors. And whether it's China, whether it's the United States, whether it is the European Union, all of these sides are now taking very proactive efforts to incentivize companies to either onshore their research and development and their manufacturing, or to reshore it or to friendshore it, as we're seeing in these US-led efforts to create a common interest with respect to other manufacturing locations on the Pacific Rim. Of course, TSMC and others, they realize this. They too understand the need to diversify not only their production and research and development, but also they understand that their clients need to diversify their sources of semiconductors. We also see that companies like TSMC are proactively taking advantage of incentives offered by governments, and we'll continue to see this as part of their efforts to diversify. Having said that, a company like TSMC, even under these rapidly evolving circumstances, will remain a decisive player in the global chip markets moving forward, and that Taiwan, as a location for research, development, and manufacturing of semiconductors, will also remain a key location moving forward.
Right, and the rift over Taiwan further complicates the outlook of Chinese equities, which have already had several major flashpoints due to the trade wars, the fear of delisting from the US stock market. What's your view on valuations of Chinese equities, both in the short term and in the long term? How should investors assess the geopolitical risks associated with the Chinese market at this point?
Right. So, Lizzie, as China continues to modernize and grow, of course, growth rates are going to go down. You're not going to see the growth rates of 10%, 8%, perhaps even 6 or 5% that we have seen in earlier phases of China's modernization and economic growth. And much of the factors driving China's model of economic growth moving forward in the past have run their course, whether that is the debt and credit-driven growth, whether that is infrastructure-driven growth, et cetera. Also, the headwinds facing China's economy are very well known. Outsiders like to reference China's demographic challenges, the debt challenges that China faces. China is well aware of these, of course. Within China, a lot of focus is now on how can China move up the value-added chain? How can China increase innovation and productivity to avoid the middle income trap? But other issues such as the rich-poor divide are big issues within China, are shaping perspectives of the economy. Of course, geopolitical uncertainties between the United States and China are also casting a further shadow on the market, and then decisions on purposes, whether that was its response to COVID, whether it's the actions against high-tech companies or education platforms, or against the real estate market last year, have also cast a certain amount of uncertainty among investors with respect to China's market. Having said that, China is roughly 1/5 of global GDP. China plays a very, very important leading role in global economic growth and will continue to do so moving forward, given the sheer size of the economy. And also, it's very, very important, I think, to emphasize, Lizzie, that knowledge and knowledge transfer is no longer a one-way street. That in important areas, China is also becoming a center of innovation. So companies know this, and companies know that they have to be in China to participate in this innovation, not only in order to compete with China in China, but also in their home markets and in third markets around the world. And so the same thing has to be true with portfolio investors. Yes, uncertainties, geopolitical risks will continue to shape the environment. Investors need to understand that. So as long as investors understand the risks, the uncertainties, and they have a keen awareness of their investment horizons and their risk preference, there will continue to be a place for Chinese equities in the portfolios of international investors.
We know you played a very important diplomatic leadership role in the U.S. Embassy in Beijing from 2016 to 2021, as we mentioned at the top of the program. That was an especially tumultuous period in the U.S.-China relationship. So how would you compare the state of affairs of U.S.-China relations now versus then?
Oh, they have changed dramatically, Lizzie, as we all know. So, I arrived in Beijing in the summer of 2016 in the run-up to the G20 summit in Hangzhou. I was in Hangzhou to support President Obama's engagement there with Xi Jinping. And already then, suspicions, mistrust, the strategic competition was playing a greater role in the bilateral relationship. And, the Chinese view that the United States wants to contain China, or at the least thwart China's modernization drive, was already, well established within Chinese strategic thinking. I did see and experience firsthand during the Trump administration that this became a mainstream, if not a near consensus view in China of U.S. intentions. And then, of course, views have only hardened under President Biden. So what did that mean as a U.S. diplomat? Well, living in Beijing has always been very pleasant. The people are gracious and welcoming. So that, let's put it that way, that didn't change. Obviously, as COVID came, then the uncertainties and restrictions related to China's COVID response have made life more difficult, I think, for foreigners well, for all people in China, but also specific challenges for foreigners and for diplomats. And what we did see, Lizzie, is that the communication between the two sides became more difficult, and the channels of communication became more difficult, and many of them atrophied over this period of time. I think that is very bad. I think that it is very, very important that the two sides maintain open channels of communication. That's very, very important to understand the other side's intentions, to explain to the other side what one's intentions are, to understand what the other side's red lines are, to delineate where the own red lines are. And then through these types of conversations, to understand what the other side's priorities are, where they are inflexible, and where they may be flexible with respect to the things that one wants out of the relationship. Particularly as strategic competition and mistrust drives the relationship, this type of communication is very, very important so that the two sides can reduce the risk of misjudgment, reduce the risk of bad decisions that can actually intensify the strategic competition and the distrust at the heart of the relationship. So having said that, it did not become easier in those 5 years, but I still remain hopeful that the two sides have a common interest in ensuring that their strategic competition and their distrust does not descend into conflict and confrontation.
If you enjoy our discussions here, I'm sure you would find value in our new powerful marketplace tool for investors, also called China Edge. It tracks, distills, and analyzes both Chinese language and English language materials about Chinese companies, business leaders, and government entities, and reviews the often hidden links between them. For our YouTube viewers, we are offering a limited time 50% discount. Just go to the link you see on the screen and use the code EDGE50. Also, sign up for the China Edge newsletter. It's a daily 2-minute rundown of China business news you don't want to miss. The link is right here on the screen. You can also click on the link in the video's description section to get your complimentary subscription today.